The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Courtroom 7B in the Philadelphia County Courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge Marcus Bennett adjusted his black robes as he settled into his leather chair, preparing for another day of family court proceedings. At 55 years old, with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had spent 15 years making life-changing decisions from behind the bench. The courtroom buzzed with the usual morning activity. Lawyers shuffled papers, court officers directed people to their seats, and nervous participants whispered to their attorneys. Among them sat Sarah Mitchell, a 35-year-old mother of two, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she watched the proceedings from the third row of the gallery. Sarah had arrived early, wanting to observe the judge's demeanor before her own custody case would be called. Her ex-husband was fighting for full custody of their children, claiming her work schedule as a night shift nurse made her an unsuitable primary caregiver. The stakes couldn't be higher for her, and she needed to understand how Judge Bennett handled such sensitive cases. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom. "The Court of Common Pleas, Family Division, is now in session, the Honorable Judge Marcus Bennett presiding." The assembled crowd rose to their feet. Judge Bennett nodded to the room before taking his seat, his movements precise and practiced. "Be seated," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority without being unnecessarily harsh. The morning docket began with a series of routine matters: name changes, uncontested divorces, and child support modifications. Judge Bennett handled each case with efficient professionalism, asking pointed questions when necessary and making swift decisions. His reputation for fairness was evident in how he gave each party their chance to speak while keeping the proceedings moving at a steady pace. "Next case," he called out, "Thompson versus Garcia, custody modification." A young couple moved to the tables in front of the bench, their attorneys flanking them. Sarah leaned forward, knowing this case was similar to her own. As Judge Bennett reviewed the case file, Sarah noticed how he would occasionally remove his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose, a small gesture that made him seem more human. He listened intently as Mrs. Thompson explained how her ex-husband's new work schedule was disrupting their children's routine. "Mr. Garcia," the judge addressed the father, "can you explain the nature of these schedule changes?" His tone was neutral but firm, seeking understanding rather than passing judgment. The morning light had shifted, now illuminating the judge's face more directly. Something about the way the light caught his features made Sarah pause. There was something familiar about his profile, something that tugged at the edges of her memory. She shook her head, trying to focus on the proceedings instead. Judge Bennett continued his questioning, drawing out important details about the children's school activities, their relationships with both parents, and the impact of the proposed changes. His approach was methodical, building a complete picture of the situation before making any decisions. "The court's primary concern," he explained to the parties, "is always the best interest of the children. We must ensure that any modification to the existing arrangement serves that purpose." His words were simple, but carried the weight of years of experience in family law. The gallery watched as he made his ruling, adjusting the custody schedule to accommodate both parents' work commitments while maintaining stability for the children. Both parties, though not entirely satisfied, nodded in acceptance of his decision. Sarah found herself studying the judge more intently now, the way he tilted his head when listening, the slight frown that appeared when he was deep in thought. These gestures stirred something in her mind, like a word sitting on the tip of her tongue, just out of reach. As the morning progressed, the courtroom settled into a rhythm of cases being called, heard, and decided. Judge Bennett maintained his composed demeanor, handling each matter with the same careful attention as the last. Yet Sarah couldn't shake the growing feeling of unease that had settled over her. Looking down at her watch, she realized her own case wouldn't be called for at least another hour. She had time to sit with this strange feeling, this nagging sensation that she knew Judge Bennett from somewhere else, somewhere beyond the confines of this courtroom. Little did anyone know that this routine morning in courtroom 7B was about to take a turn that would shake the foundations of justice itself. Sarah Mitchell's hands grew clammy as she continued to watch Judge Bennett from her seat in the gallery. The morning sun had risen higher now, and the courtroom had grown warmer, but that wasn't what was making her uncomfortable. With each passing minute, the strange feeling of recognition grew stronger, like a puzzle slowly piecing itself together in her mind. Another case finished, and the judge reached for his water glass. The simple motion triggered something in Sarah's memory, a flash of headlights, the sound of breaking glass. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. When she opened them again, she focused on Judge Bennett's face with renewed intensity. He was younger than she at first thought, probably in his mid-50s. His hair was mostly gray now, but Sarah could see traces of the dark brown. It must have been years ago. The way he moved his hands when he spoke, gesturing to emphasize important points, there was something so familiar about it that it made her stomach twist into knots. A young lawyer approached the bench with some paperwork, and Judge Bennett leaned forward to review it. The angle of his profile against the morning light suddenly transported Sarah back 25 years. She was 16 again, lying in a hospital bed, trying desperately to remember the face she had seen through her parents' car window that rainy night. The face that had looked their way for just a moment before speeding away into the darkness. Sarah's heart began to race. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands and quickly searched for older photos of Judge Marcus Bennett. As she scrolled through images from news articles and legal ceremonies over the years, she found what she was looking for: a photo from his early days as a lawyer, nearly 25 years ago. The same sharp nose, the same way of tilting his head, the same gesture of running his hand through his hair when deep in thought. The memories came flooding back now, no longer just fragments but a torrent of images and sounds. The squealing of tires on wet pavement, the horrified look on her mother's face, the dark sedan that had come out of nowhere, its driver's features illuminated for just a second by the street lights. Features that now sat before her, wearing a judge's robes and deciding the fates of others. Sarah watched as Judge Bennett handled another case, her mind racing with the implications of what she was realizing. His voice, which had seemed so authoritative earlier, now carried echoes of that night, the sound of a car door slamming, footsteps hurrying away from the crash site, leaving her family broken and bleeding on the road. She pulled out an old photo from her wallet, one of the last pictures taken of her family together. Her parents smiled back at her, unaware that their lives would end just days after this moment. Sarah had carried this photo everywhere for 25 years, a reminder of what she had lost and the justice that had never been served. The bailiff called another case, but Sarah barely heard it. She was lost in her memories, comparing every movement Judge Bennett made with the fragments of that tragic night that had haunted her for so long. The way he wrote in his notepad, left-handed, with a slight tilt to his paper, just like the figure she remembered glimpsing through the rain-streaked windows. Around her, the courtroom continued its normal routine. Lawyers presented their arguments, clients whispered to their attorneys, and court officers maintained order. But for Sarah, time seemed to stand still. The weight of her revelation pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She watched as Judge Bennett called for a brief recess, standing up from his bench with the same fluid motion she had seen that night, when he had stepped out of his car for just a moment, looked at the wreckage he had caused, and then fled into the darkness. The memory was crystal clear now, as if the decades between then and now had suddenly vanished. Sarah's own custody case would be called soon, but that no longer seemed important. A much bigger issue now consumed her thoughts. Here sat the man who had destroyed her family, who had left her an orphan, who had escaped consequences for his actions, and he now sat in judgment of others, deciding the fates of families like the one he had torn apart. As the recess continued, Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her. The trembling in her hands stopped, the panic in her chest subsided. In its place came a steely determination. After 25 years of wondering, of searching for answers, of trying to piece together the fragments of that horrible night, she finally knew the truth. And she knew what she had to do next. The memories of that rainy October night in 1999 rushed through Sarah's mind as she sat in the courtroom, each detail now sharper than it had been in years. She remembered how her father had picked her up from band practice, her clarinet case carefully placed in the back seat. Her mother had brought hot chocolate in a thermos, knowing Sarah would be cold after practicing outside for the school's upcoming performance. The windshield wipers had fought against the heavy rain, creating a steady rhythm that had almost lulled 16-year-old Sarah to sleep in the back seat. Her parents had been talking softly in the front, discussing plans for her upcoming birthday. Her mother had turned around to ask Sarah what kind of cake she wanted, and that's when everything changed. The dark sedan had come out of nowhere, running the red light at the intersection of Maple and 4th. Sarah remembered the horrible sound of metal crushing metal, the world spinning as their car flipped twice before coming to rest against a light pole. In those few seconds before the other driver fled, Sarah had seen his face clearly in the street light, young, clean-shaven, wearing wire-rimmed glasses that glinted in the rain. Now, sitting in courtroom 7B, Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to the scar on her left shoulder, a permanent reminder of that night. The doctors had told her she was lucky to survive. 3 broken ribs, a fractured collarbone, and a severe concussion had kept her in the hospital for weeks. But her parents hadn't been as fortunate. Her father had died instantly. Her mother had held on for 2 days in the ICU before joining him. The police investigation had gone nowhere. They had found paint transfers from a dark blue sedan, probably a BMW, but in the days before widespread traffic cameras, they had little else to go on. Sarah had worked with a sketch artist, but her concussion had made the memories fuzzy. Until today, when every detail suddenly snapped into crystal clear focus as she watched Judge Bennett move about his courtroom. After the accident, Sarah had bounced between relatives' homes, finally settling with her Aunt Patricia in South Philadelphia. Her aunt had done her best, but nothing could fill the void left by her parents' deaths. The nights had been the hardest, filled with nightmares of screeching tires and breaking glass. She had spent years in therapy, trying to process her trauma and grief. Detective James Morrison had been assigned to the case. He had visited Sarah regularly for the first year, bringing updates that never led anywhere. She remembered his kind eyes and the way he would bring her favorite candy bars, trying to make the painful interviews a little easier. He had retired 5 years ago, still apologizing for never solving the case. Sarah had graduated high school, then nursing school, carrying her loss like a heavy shadow. She had turned her pain into purpose, choosing to work in the trauma unit of Philadelphia General Hospital, helping other victims of accidents. Her colleagues admired her calm presence during crisis situations, never knowing that each car crash victim brought back echoes of her own tragedy. The newspapers from 1999 had called it the Halloween hit and run because it had happened just a few days before the holiday. Sarah still had the clippings in a box under her bed, along with her parents' wedding album and the clothes she had been wearing that night, which her aunt had saved despite the hospital's attempts to throw them away. Life had moved forward, as it always does. Sarah had married Tom Mitchell, had 2 beautiful children, and built a new family. But the hole in her heart had never fully healed. Every birthday, every holiday, every special moment in her children's lives was touched by the absence of their grandparents, who they would never know. She had searched faces in crowds for years, wondering if she would recognize the driver who had destroyed her family. She had jumped every time she saw a dark blue sedan, her heart racing until she confirmed it wasn't the same car. The trauma counselors had told her she needed to let go, to stop looking, to focus on healing. But now, watching Judge Bennett arrange his papers on the bench, Sarah knew why she had never been able to let go. Her subconscious had been holding on to every detail of that face, waiting for this moment when the truth would finally emerge. The young law student who had fled into the rainy night had become the distinguished judge, who now held the power to shape other families' futures. The irony was almost too much to bear. The courtroom clock ticked past 11:30 as Judge Bennett called for the next case. Sarah's hands had stopped shaking, replaced by an eerie calm that settled over her like a heavy blanket. She watched as he adjusted his glasses, the same nervous habit she had witnessed on that rainy night when he had stepped out of his car for just a moment before fleeing the scene. Calling the matter of Davidson versus Thompson, the clerk announced, shuffling through papers on her desk. The words seemed distant to Sarah, as if coming from underwater. Her own custody case was still 3 cases away, but she knew she couldn't wait any longer. 25 years of silence pressed against her chest, demanding to be broken. Judge Bennett began addressing the parties in his usual measured tones, asking about custody arrangements and visitation schedules. Sarah noticed how his left hand tapped lightly on the bench when he spoke, another gesture that matched her memories perfectly. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was right. Without conscious thought, Sarah found herself rising from her seat. The wooden bench creaked beneath her, drawing a few curious glances from nearby observers. A court officer took a step in her direction, but she was already moving forward, her feet carrying her past the gallery's barrier. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat," the officer warned, his voice firm but not yet alarmed. Other voices joined his, a mix of whispers and concerned murmurs spreading through the courtroom like ripples in a pond. Judge Bennett looked up from his papers, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to confusion as he saw Sarah standing in the middle of his courtroom. "Miss, this is not your case. Please return to the gallery and wait for your matter to be called," he said, using the same authoritative tone he had employed countless times before. Sarah stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on his face. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and someone coughed nervously in the back of the room. Time seemed to stretch like a rubber band pulled too tight, ready to snap at any moment. "October 28, 1999, Sarah said, her voice clear and steady. The date hung in the air like a physical thing. She watched as the first flicker of recognition crossed Judge Bennett's face, so subtle that only someone who had been studying his every expression would have noticed it. The court officer took another step forward, but Sarah didn't move. Her next words cut through the tension like a knife. "You killed them." 3 simple words. 3 syllables that shattered the carefully maintained order of Courtroom 7B. Judge Bennett's face, which had maintained its professional mask for so many years, suddenly drained of all color. His hands, usually steady as he wrote in his legal pad, froze in mid-motion. "Your Honor, shall I remove her?" the court officer asked, already reaching for Sarah's arm. But something in Judge Bennett's reaction made him hesitate. The judge's usual composure had cracked, revealing something underneath that made everyone in the room hold their breath. The intersection of Maple and 4th, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "A rainy night, a dark blue BMW. A 16-year-old girl in the back seat, parents in the front. You looked right at us before you drove away." Judge Bennett's water glass slipped from his trembling fingers, spilling across his desk. Papers scattered, but no one moved to pick them up. The entire courtroom sat frozen, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of confusion and growing understanding. I don't know what you're talking about," Judge Bennett managed to say, but his voice had lost all its authority. The words came out weak and hollow, like air escaping from a punctured tire. "I remember your face," Sarah said, taking another step forward. "I see it every night in my dreams, the same face that's been sitting up there, judging others, while my parents lie in their graves." The gallery erupted in whispers. Lawyers exchanged shocked glances. Court reporters stopped typing, their fingers hovering over their keyboards. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened as additional security personnel responded to the disturbance, but they too stopped short at the scene before them. Judge Marcus Bennett, who had presided over thousands of cases with unwavering confidence, now sat motionless behind his bench, his face ashen, this carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around him. And in the center of his courtroom stood Sarah Mitchell, 25 years of buried truth finally rising to the surface, waiting for justice to finish what fate had started on that rainy October night. The next few moments in Courtroom 7B unfolded like scenes from a movie played in slow motion. Judge Bennett's hands gripped the edge of his bench so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His face had taken on a gray color that made him look years older than he had just minutes before. A thin sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead, catching the fluorescent light from above. "Clear the courtroom," he managed to say, but his voice cracked on the last word. The authority that had commanded this space for 15 years had vanished, replaced by something that sounded very much like fear. The court clerk looked uncertain, her hand hovering over the phone on her desk. Sarah remained standing in the center of the room, her accusations still echoing off the wood-paneled walls. The court officers, trained to handle disruptions, seemed unsure how to proceed. The usual protocol for removing a disturbing party didn't seem to fit this situation, not with Judge Bennett's reaction lending weight to every word Sarah had spoken. "I said clear the..." Judge Bennett tried again, but stopped as his eyes met Sarah's. In that moment, everyone in the courtroom could see the recognition flash across his face, the memory of a rainy night, a terrible choice, and 25 years of buried guilt suddenly surfacing. Lawyers began gathering their papers, but nobody moved toward the exits. The spectacle unfolding before them was too compelling to leave. Phones appeared in hands, their cameras capturing the moment when justice took an unexpected turn. The court reporter's fingers remained frozen over her keyboard, the official record of these extraordinary events waiting to be documented. "Your Honor," a voice called from the back of the courtroom. Detective James Morrison, now retired but still carrying his badge as a consultant, stepped forward. He had been waiting for his testimony in another case, but now he moved with purpose toward the front of the room. I remember this case. The Halloween hit and run of '99. Judge Bennett's right hand moved to his chest, clutching at his robes. His breathing had become shallow and rapid. The bailiff, noticing the judge's distress, stepped closer to the bench. "Should I call medical assistance, Your Honor?" But before anyone could respond, Judge Bennett's composure crumbled completely. "I never meant," he started, his words barely audible. The courtroom fell silent, straining to hear what would come next. The rain, I couldn't see clearly. I was afraid. The admission hung in the air like smoke, changing the atmosphere from tension to shock. Sarah's shoulders straightened, years of uncertainty finally giving way to confirmation. Detective Morrison had already pulled out his phone, speaking quietly but urgently into it as he kept his eyes fixed on the scene. The young lawyer from the case that had been interrupted stood up. "Your Honor, given what's transpiring, I move for an immediate recess." Others in the courtroom began speaking at once, their voices mixing into a rising tide of confusion and concern. Judge Bennett tried to stand, perhaps to retreat to his chambers, but his legs seemed unable to support him. He sank back into his chair, the weight of his long-held secret finally becoming too heavy to bear. The proud figure who had passed judgment on others for so many years now sat exposed, his own guilt written clearly across his face. Two more police officers appeared at the courtroom doors, responding to Detective Morrison's call. The detective was already approaching the bench, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of the situation. "Judge Bennett," he said, his voice carrying the weight of official authority, "I believe we need to have a conversation about the events of October 28, 1999. The gallery had erupted into chaos, with people pulling out phones to make calls or take pictures. Court officers struggled to maintain order, their voices competing with the growing noise. Through it all, Sarah stood unmoved, like the eye of a storm, watching as the truths she had carried for 25 years finally began to unravel the carefully constructed life of the man who had destroyed her family. Judge Bennett's judicial assistant hurried to his side with a glass of water, but his hands shook too badly to hold it. The man who had begun the morning as one of Philadelphia's most respected judges now sat trembling behind his bench, his career and freedom balanced on the edge of a precipice, all because of 3 words spoken by a woman who had never stopped searching for justice. The Philadelphia Police Department's cold case unit buzzed with renewed energy in the days following the courtroom confrontation. Detective Morrison, though retired, had been called back as a special consultant, his intimate knowledge of the original investigation proving invaluable. He sat at his old desk, now temporarily reassigned to him, surrounded by boxes of evidence from the 1999 hit and run case. The paint samples were still in evidence storage. Detective Lisa Chen, the lead investigator on the reopened case, said as she placed a small evidence bag on Morrison's desk. "Modern analysis techniques might tell us more than we could get back then. The blue paint chips, carefully preserved for 25 years, could now be tested with technology that didn't exist when the accident occurred." News of the courtroom confrontation had spread quickly through Philadelphia's legal community. Judge Bennett had been placed on immediate administrative leave, pending investigation. His face appeared on every local news channel, and the story had even gained national attention. The respected judge's carefully constructed facade began to crack under the weight of public scrutiny. Sarah spent hours at the police station, giving detailed statements about that night. Her memories, triggered by seeing Bennett in court, provided crucial details that had been too fuzzy in the traumatic aftermath of the accident. "The way he adjusts his glasses," she explained to Detective Chen, "it's exactly the same motion I saw that night when he got out of his car for those few seconds." As the investigation gained momentum, unexpected witnesses began coming forward. A valet from the University Club, now in his 50s, remembered parking a dark blue BMW the night of the accident. The car had front-end damage that the owner, a young law student, had explained away as a parking garage incident. "I knew something wasn't right," the valet told the investigators, his conscience finally pushing him to speak. "But he was from a powerful family, and I needed that job to pay for college." He provided records he had kept from his time working at the club, including a logbook showing Bennett's car being parked shortly after the time of the accident. The investigators also discovered that Bennett's father, a prominent Philadelphia attorney in the 1990s, had made several large payments to an auto body shop the week after the accident. The shop's old records, stored in a dusty warehouse, showed repairs to a dark blue BMW matching the damage pattern from the hit and run. Detective Chen assigned a team to dig through Bennett's past. They found his old law school records, confirming he had been a student at the time of the accident. His class schedule showed he would have been driving home from a late-night study group at the exact time the crash occurred. More importantly, they discovered he had suddenly withdrawn from classes for 2 weeks following the accident, citing personal reasons. "The pieces are finally coming together," Morrison said, getting another document to the investigation board. The wall was covered with photographs, statements, and connection lines, building a clear picture of what had happened that rainy October night. "You must have had help covering this up." Sarah visited the investigation room regularly, watching as new evidence arrived each day. The cold case that had haunted her for 25 years was finally warming up, revealing its secrets. She brought her parents' photo to one of these visits, placing it on Detective Chen's desk. "They would have wanted to know the truth," she said quietly. Bank records from 1999 revealed unusual movements in the Bennett family accounts. Large withdrawals had been made in the weeks following the accident, but their destination remained unclear. Detective Chen assigned a financial crime specialist to track the money trail, suspecting it might lead to others who had helped conceal the truth. A breakthrough came when a retired mechanic contacted the police after seeing the story on the news. He remembered working on a BMW matching the description, noting that the repairs seemed rushed and the payment was made in cash. His detailed records from that time, kept in case of warranty issues, included the vehicle's VIN number. As the investigation expanded, it became clear that the cover-up extended beyond just Judge Bennett. The detectives began uncovering a network of influence and privilege that had worked to protect a young law student from the consequences of his actions, allowing him to build a career on the foundation of a terrible secret. 2 months after Sarah's courtroom confrontation, Judge Marcus Bennett sat on the other side of the justice system, wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of his familiar black robes. The main courtroom of the Philadelphia Criminal Justice Center was packed with reporters and spectators, all eager to witness the fall of one of the city's most prominent judges. District Attorney Maria Rodriguez stood before the court, her voice firm as she presented the case against Bennett. "Your Honor," she addressed Judge Thompson, who had been brought in from Pittsburgh to ensure impartiality. "The evidence before us today reveals not just a tragic accident, but 25 years of deliberate deception." The prosecution had built an airtight case. Bennett's BMW, long since sold and repainted, had been tracked down in Ohio. Modern forensic techniques applied to the original paint samples showed an exact match to the fragments found at the crash scene. Bank records revealed a complex web of payments made to silence potential witnesses. Bennett's father, now in his 80s, had been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony about the cover-up. He sat in his wheelchair near the front of the courtroom, looking much older than his years as he listened to the evidence against his son. His testimony had revealed how he had used his connections to protect his son, never imagining the weight of guilt that would follow them both for decades. Sarah watched from her seat beside Detective Morrison as photographs from the accident scene were displayed on the courtroom's large screen. Her parents' crushed car, the scattered glass, the skid marks on the wet pavement. Each image told part of the story that had changed her life forever. Some spectators turned away from the graphic images, but Sarah kept her eyes forward, finally seeing the full truth of that night laid bare. The defendant's actions show a pattern of conscious choices. De Rodriguez continued. The choice to flee the scene, the choice to hide evidence, the choice to accept his father's help in covering up his crime, and perhaps most disturbing, the choice to pursue a career in law, sitting in judgment of others while hiding his own guilt. Bennett's defense team had advised him to plead guilty to reduce his sentence, but the charges went beyond just the hit and run. He faced additional counts of obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and abuse of judicial authority. The investigation had revealed that he had used his position as judge to access and suppress information about the old case whenever it threatened to resurface. In his 15 years on the bench, Rodriguez explained, the defendant handled over 12,000 cases. Each one of those cases is now under review, as his moral authority to pass judgment has been fundamentally compromised. The implications of Bennett's crimes reached far beyond his own case, throwing years of legal decisions into question. Detective Chen sat at the prosecution table, surrounded by boxes of evidence. Her team had worked tirelessly, following every lead, interviewing dozens of witnesses, and piecing together financial records from multiple states. The breakthrough had come when they found Bennett's old college roommate, who remembered him returning to their apartment that rainy night, panicked and driving a damaged car. Bennett himself had aged visibly in the 2 months since his arrest. His hair had turned completely gray, and deep lines marked his face. He sat slumped at the defense table, barely resembling the confident judge who had presided over Courtroom 7B for so many years. His wife had filed for divorce upon learning the full extent of his deception, unable to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the truth that had emerged. The state will prove, Rodriguez concluded, that the defendant's rise to power was built on the foundation of Sarah Mitchell's tragedy. While she struggled with the loss of her parents, he built a career. While she searched for answers, he hid evidence. While she sought justice, he presided over it, making a mockery of the very system he claimed to serve. The irony of Bennett being judged in the same system where he had once wielded authority was not lost on anyone present. The journalists scribbled notes furiously, knowing this case would be studied in law schools for years to come. It represented not just the solving of a cold case, but a profound breach of judicial trust that had shaken Philadelphia's entire legal community to its core. 1 year after Judge Marcus Bennett's conviction, Sarah Mitchell stood at a podium in the Philadelphia City Hall's main conference room. The space was filled with reporters, city officials, and families of hit-and-run victims. A large banner behind her read, "Mitchell Foundation for Justice, supporting victims and their families." Sarah adjusted the microphone, her hands steady as she addressed the crowd. 26 years ago, I lost my parents to a hit-and-run driver who thought his privilege could protect him from justice, she began. Today, we're turning that tragedy into hope for others. The audience listened intently, many nodding in understanding and support. Bennett was now serving a 15-year sentence in state prison. His conviction had sent shockwaves through Philadelphia's legal community, leading to major reforms in judicial oversight and the handling of cold cases. The task force reviewing his previous cases had already overturned 37 convictions where his hidden guilt might have influenced his judgment. Detective Morrison, now serving as the Foundation's senior advisor, sat in the front row. His retirement had turned into a new mission, helping the Foundation establish connections with law enforcement agencies across the country. Thanks to his efforts, they had already helped reopen dozens of cold case hit-and-runs in different states. The Foundation isn't just about finding justice, Sarah continued, her voice strong and clear. It's about supporting families through their darkest moments. She explained how the organization would provide immediate assistance to hit-and-run victims' families, including counseling services, legal aid, and financial support for funeral expenses. The Foundation's first major initiative was the creation of a nationwide database of hit-and-run cases using advanced technology to cross-reference vehicle descriptions, damage patterns, and witness accounts. They had partnered with forensic labs to provide modern analysis of evidence from old cases, giving hope to families who had waited years for answers. In the audience sat Tom Wilson, the auto body shop worker whose testimony had helped convict Bennett. His decision to come forward had inspired others to break their silence about similar cases. The Foundation had created a whistleblower protection program, named in his honor, to support those who chose truth over silence. We've also established the Mitchell Scholarship, Sarah announced, bringing a smile to many faces. Every year, we'll help 10 children who have lost parents to hit-and-run accidents attend college. She touched the locket she always wore, containing her parents' picture. Education was everything to my parents. This is how we honor their memory. Detective Chen, who had led Bennett's investigation, had joined the Foundation's board of directors. Her experience had proven invaluable in creating training programs for police departments, teaching them new techniques for investigating hit-and-run cases. The Chen Protocol was already being adopted by major cities across the country. Sarah's own children sat in the audience, now old enough to understand the full story of their grandparents' death and their mother's long journey for justice. Her daughter Emma, 16 like Sarah had been during the accident, had started a youth outreach program through the Foundation, helping other teenagers cope with similar losses. The Foundation's headquarters, located in a renovated building near the courthouse where Bennett had once presided, housed a team of dedicated professionals, investigators, counselors, legal experts, and victim advocates. The walls displayed photos of families they had helped, each picture representing a story of loss transformed into purpose. Today, we're announcing our biggest initiative yet, Sarah revealed, her voice filled with determination. The foundation is partnering with the Department of Transportation to install advanced camera systems at high-risk intersections across the city. The program would combine artificial intelligence with traditional surveillance to better identify vehicles involved in hit-and-runs. As she concluded her speech, Sarah shared the news that the Foundation's work had already led to solving 5 cold cases in the past year alone. Families who had waited decades for answers finally found closure, thanks to the resources and support the Foundation provided. The room erupted in applause as Sarah finished speaking. She had transformed her personal tragedy into a force for positive change, creating a legacy that would help countless others find the justice and support they deserved. As she stepped away from the podium, she touched her locket one last time, knowing her parents would be proud of how their story had become a beacon of hope for others.